He kept fighting for 3 years after the war ended, not because he was crazy, not because he didn't know how to shoot, but because nobody went to him to tell him he could stop. And when you're trained to never stop, silence can be more dangerous than any armed enemy. The story you're about to hear isn't just about Vietnam. It's about what happens when war ends in the world, but doesn't end inside someone. At the height of the Vietnam War, men were sent on missions that officially never existed. There were no medals. There was no public recognition. Just one simple, absolute instruction. Keep going. Keep going even if you lose contact. Keep going even if the radio fails. Keep going even if everyone around you disappears. The logic was clear. Amid the global tension of the Cold War, any failure could mean strategic advantage for the other side. Soviet support for North Vietnam fueled the paranoia. Every piece of information was valuable, every silence suspicious. Our character was an undercover reconnaissance operator near the Laotian border. He wasn't a headline hero. He was an expert at observing without being seen, moving without leaving a trace, surviving with almost nothing. During training, they repeated something to him that sounded almost like an oath. Never trust surrender messages. The enemy can lie, leaflets can be fake, transmissions can be traps. If communication fails, follow the last order received. The mission is bigger than you. That phrase stuck in his mind. The mission is bigger than you. Then, on an ordinary day in the humid, stifling jungle, the radio simply stopped. First came the noise, then silence. He adjusted the frequency, tried alternative codes, waited for the agreed-upon time for contact. Nothing. No response. Only the distant sound of insects and rustling leaves. In his logic, this didn't mean the end. It meant interference, maybe an attack, maybe sabotage. What would a soldier trained to be suspicious do at that moment? Would he believe the war was over? Or would he believe he was alone behind enemy lines? Days later, he found a leaflet attached to a branch. It said the war was nearing its end. It promised amnesty. It demanded surrender. He tore up the paper and burned the pieces. During training, they showed him historical examples of psychological propaganda. They said the enemy would use any means to weaken the mind before trying to weaken the body. If he believed that leaflet, he would be betraying the mission. But what if the leaflet was true? How could he distinguish truth from manipulation when his own survival depended on trusting nothing? On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell. Helicopters evacuated the American embassy. The images went around the world. The war officially ended. Governments signed documents. Speeches were made. Flags were exchanged. But he was in the jungle. He didn't see the images. He didn't hear the speeches. The world celebrated the end of a conflict that had lasted decades, while he continued counting ammunition, marking trails, and noting enemy movements in a notebook that no one else would ever read. This is the most disturbing point in the story. The war ended in the newspapers, but not on the ground where he was. His mind continued to operate within a logic of combat. He slept in short cycles. He constantly changed position. He watched shadows with suspicion. Every noise was a threat. Every movement was a possible ambush. How long can a human being live in this state before war becomes a permanent part of their identity? There are real records of soldiers who remained in hiding after the official end of conflicts, such as Hiru Onoda, who only surrendered decades later because his former commander personally came to him. He trusted no one but the authority who trained him. And this raises a disturbing question. If no one comes to give the final order, does the soldier continue fighting forever? Our character had no commander to return to. Many had been evacuated. Others were dead. The chain of command had simply evaporated. He awaited confirmation that would never come. Each day without contact reinforced his conviction that he needed to continue. Perhaps the base was under attack. Perhaps the silence was strategic. Perhaps he was the last invisible line of a war that was not yet over. But deep down, a doubt began to creep in. Small, silent. What if the world had truly moved on? What if new generations were growing up without knowing he still existed in that jungle? What if the mission he protected had already lost its political meaning? What would be left for him when he finally stopped? Because stopping wouldn't just mean dropping the weapon. It would mean admitting that perhaps no one was waiting for him anymore, and that possibility is harder to face than any armed enemy. While the jungle remained dense and indifferent, an invisible battle began within him. A battle between the order he received and the reality he couldn't confirm. And it is precisely here that the story ceases to be merely military and becomes human. Because in the next part, something will happen that will brutally test this conviction. Months began to turn into years, and the only thing that didn't change was his routine. Every morning he checked the terrain, inspected improvised traps, analyzed tracks in the mud. He still operated, as he had been trained by the United States. Discipline, precision, silence. For many who served at that time, this is familiar. The training doesn't disappear when the conflict ends. It remains present in the way you cross a street, observe an environment, assess risks. Now imagine living like that without pause, without return, without confirmation that the mission is over. While the country struggled to emotionally recover from the fall of Saigon, he continued to execute standard procedures. In the United States, families watched the evacuation images on television. Veterans returned home, trying to adapt to civilian life, many struggling to explain what they had experienced. Some woke up at night with memories that seemed all too real. The difference was that for them, there was at least the awareness that the war was over. For him, there wasn't. One day, he observed a small nearby village. There were flags different from any he knew. The people seemed to live in relative tranquility. Children ran around, farmers worked, merchants traded. That scene conflicted with everything he believed. If the war continued, why weren't there troops constantly on the move? Why did the atmosphere seem less tense? He registered this as a possible disinformation strategy. After all, he had been trained to be suspicious of normalcy in hostile territory. Here arises a micro-conflict that any ex-military person understands. What to do when the signs from the environment don't confirm the threat you were prepared to face. In everyday life, this happens when someone returns home after years of service and realizes that the neighborhood has changed, that friends have gone their separate ways, that the world is no longer as organized as before. The mind takes time to update its internal maps. In his case, updating meant abandoning the last order he received, and abandoning that order was unthinkable. At one point, he intercepted a weak radio transmission, with voices talking about reconstruction and reunification. He didn't catch everything. The signal was unstable, but he heard words that didn't make sense in an active war scenario. He could have considered the possibility that the conflict had actually ended. However, he remembered what his instructors had said about psychological warfare. The enemy can simulate stability to expose hidden agents. If he relaxed, he would be vulnerable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, many American veterans were trying to rebuild their lives. Some enrolled in universities, others opened small businesses. Some faced cold stares and public criticism. Society was changing rapidly. The Cold War continued on other fronts, but Vietnam had become a painful memory. For those who served, loyalty to comrades and the mission remained strong. And that is precisely why this man's story is so disturbing. He represented the extreme of fidelity to the oath. Over time, food became scarcer. Ammunition began to dwindle. He started avoiding direct confrontations, prioritizing observation. His beard grew. His clothes wore out. Still, his posture remained firm. He mentally reviewed procedures learned years before. He repeated to himself that the United States does not abandon its men. If the silence continued, it was because there was a greater strategic reason. This belief sustained him. But a doubt resurfaced when he found an old newspaper used as packaging in a small village. The date was clear. The year indicated that too much time had passed since the last communication he had received. He noticed headlines that didn't mention active fighting. They spoke of agreements, political changes, reconstruction. This shook his certainty. If it was propaganda, it was extremely elaborate. If it was true, it meant he was fighting alone against an enemy that might not even be at war with his country anymore. This is the point where the story ceases to be merely military and becomes profoundly human. How often does someone continue to live under old rules, even when reality has changed? A father who maintains the same rigidity years after his children have grown up. A worker who follows patterns that no longer make sense in the new market. The mind takes time to accept that the mission of the previous phase is over. For a soldier trained in survival logic, this transition is even more brutal. The tension rises when he realizes he's being watched. Not by organized troops, but by curious locals. They don't treat him as a declared enemy. They observe from a distance. They don't show extreme fear. This confuses him even more. If he were an active target in an ongoing war, there would be mobilization. Instead, there is silence and distance. Now the inevitable question arises. If no one is trying to eliminate it, what does that mean? That it's irrelevant, that the war is truly over, or that it has become a vestige of a conflict the world has already archived? The hardest part isn't surviving in the jungle. It's surviving the idea that his struggle may no longer have a purpose, and it's precisely at this point that something unexpected begins to approach him. It's not a traditional ambush. It's not an attack. It's something far more disconcerting, and when that encounter happens, he will be forced to confront a truth that no amount of training could have prepared him to face. The encounter didn't involve gunfire. There were no shouts, no chase. It was a slow, almost absurd approach. He first noticed an older man walking alone along a trail he had been monitoring for months. There was no visible weapon, no escort, just a simple hat, ordinary clothes, and a look that conveyed no hostility. This contradicted all the security logic he had learned. No one approaches a potentially isolated combatant in this way. So why was this man walking towards him without fear? He observed for hours before moving. The discipline was still impeccable. The wind was favorable. He could disappear without a trace, but he decided to stay. The stranger sat on a log, placed a small bag on the ground, and spoke loudly in hesitant English that the war had ended years ago. He said that many American soldiers were already home. He said that the world had moved on. This was not a threat. It was information. And information can be more destabilizing than any explosion. He could have shot. He could have retreated. He could have ignored it. Instead, he remained motionless, listening. The man spoke of reconstruction, of families who never saw each other again, of cities being reorganized. He even spoke of tourists beginning to visit previously devastated regions. Tourists, the word echoed in his mind as something impossible. How can tourism exist where he still operates in combat mode? Has the world really changed that much while he remains trapped by a final order? The break from the norm wasn't just the man's presence, but his demeanor. There was no hatred, no provocation, just quiet persistence, and that began to gnaw at something within the soldier. For years, he had maintained the conviction that he was still protecting the strategic interests of the United States. But what strategic interest demands absolute silence for so long? What legitimate mission leaves a man without communication for years? This question began to become impossible to ignore. In the following days, the man returned. He brought more recent newspapers. He brought photographs of rebuilt cities. He brought images of American soldiers returning home years before. He showed dates. He showed different presidents. He showed that the geopolitical landscape had changed. The Cold War continued in other regions, but Vietnam was no longer the active field of direct confrontation between the superpowers. Soviet support had served its purpose. Reunification had been consolidated. The world was in a different phase. And here arises the most uncomfortable question of all. If the war ended and no one came to get him, what does that mean about the value of his presence there? He always believed that the United States doesn't abandon its men. That belief sustained his resistance. But perhaps it wasn't abandonment. Perhaps it was chaos. Perhaps it was disorganization. Perhaps he was simply cut off from information at a critical moment. The difference between abandonment and communication failure is enormous. But for someone who is isolated, the effect is the same. He began mentally comparing dates, the last transmission he received, the moment the radio went silent. The fall of Saigon, the headlines shown in the newspapers, the math was cruel. He had been operating alone for too long, and then came another internal rupture. If he continued acting, he could cause unnecessary incidents. He could hurt people who were no longer at war with his country. He could turn loyalty into error. This realization was more difficult than facing any enemy patrol. There comes a moment in any soldier's life when he needs to distinguish courage from stubbornness. Courage is fulfilling the mission when there is a clear purpose. Stubbornness is persisting when the purpose has disappeared. How can you tell the difference when you don't have complete access to the truth? He realized he was fighting a shadow of the past. There were no more front lines. There were no more coordinated offensives. There was only him and the jungle, repeating procedures that no longer altered any strategic outcome. The approaching man posed no physical threat. He represented the possibility that it was all truly over. And that possibility was devastating. Because if it were true, he would have to face a new question. Who is he without the mission? For years he had woken up with a clear objective. Observe, report, survive. Protect interests greater than his own life. If that objective vanished, what remained? An aging man in the jungle with combat skills no longer needed. He spent an entire night awake, remembering his training in the United States. He remembered the instructors talking about honor, loyalty, and duty. He remembered the comrades who didn't return. He remembered the families waiting for news. If he truly was the last one, continuing to fight wouldn't honor those names. It might even tarnish their memory. This realization was slow and painful, and then came the decision that no manual taught how to make. He descended from the elevated position where he had been hiding. He walked towards the man who was waiting for him again on the trail. There was no formal surrender, no ceremony, just a simple gesture from someone who accepts that the war is over. But the moment he took that step, something unexpected happened inside him. The silence that had previously meant mission now meant emptiness. And facing that emptiness can be harder than surviving the jungle. Now the question is no longer whether the war is over. The question is what happens to a soldier when the only identity he knew ceases to exist. And it is precisely here that the story enters its deepest and most disturbing phase, because returning home is not the end of the battle. Often, it is only the beginning of another. When he finally left the jungle, there were no cheers, no cameras, no flags. There was only a world different from the one he remembered. Vietnam was no longer the same battlefield he had known. Roads were being rebuilt. Markets were functioning. Children attended school. The scene didn't match the mental maps he had carried for years. The contrast was so stark it seemed unreal. He had prepared to survive ambushes, but not to survive normalcy. The return to the United States was even more disorienting. While he measured the time by the amount of ammunition remaining and the changing seasons in the jungle, his country was undergoing profound transformations. The Cold War continued on other strategic fronts, but Vietnam was already part of a closed chapter. Statistics showed that more than 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. More than 58,000 lost their lives. Thousands returned carrying visible and invisible wounds. He was not part of the known statistics. It was as if he had existed outside the record. There's a fact that few mention. Many veterans faced significant difficulties upon returning. Studies conducted decades later indicated high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among Vietnam War veterans. Some accounts show that reintegration was more challenging than the combat itself. This does not diminish the honor of the service rendered. On the contrary, it highlights the true weight of the responsibility assumed by those who served. And it is in this context that his story fits even more intensely. Imagine returning home and realizing that the culture has changed. The music is different, the politics are different, social priorities have shifted. You leave an environment where every decision is a matter of survival, and enter a world where concerns seem distant from the reality you lived in. Many veterans reported feeling like they were living in two time periods simultaneously. The past remained active in their minds, while the present demanded constant adaptation. he carried something even more unique: years of absolute isolation. While other soldiers experienced a gradual transition from the battlefield to returning, he went straight from one extreme to the other. In the jungle, every sound was analyzed. In the United States, the excess of stimuli was overwhelming: crowded supermarkets, heavy traffic, people discussing trivial matters. How to adjust the nervous system to this new reality after so long operating in high alert mode? There's an interesting fact about the human brain. When exposed to threatening environments for extended periods, it adapts to identify risks more quickly. This adaptation is useful in combat, but it can become an obstacle in civilian life. He automatically perceived emergency exits. He assessed positions in rooms. He observed behavioral patterns. It was a skill acquired in service to the nation, but one that now needed to be reorganized for a different context. At the same time, American culture holds a profound value: honoring those who serve. Over the years, recognition of Vietnam veterans has strengthened. Memorials have been built, ceremonies have been held, the country has revisited its history with greater maturity. He, who had remained invisible for so long, came to symbolize something greater than his own trajectory. He represented loyalty taken to the limit. He represented unwavering commitment to a mission received. But there is an unexpected aspect to this phase of the story. When he was asked why he stayed on for so long, the answer wasn't anger or resentment. It was conviction. He believed he was doing his duty. This answer resonates with many former American servicemen. Service isn't driven solely by political strategy. It's driven by responsibility to comrades and country. This mentality is central to American military culture. At the same time, the story raises an important reflection. How many men and women carry internal battles years after a conflict has officially ended? Recent statistics indicate that psychological support for veterans has become an increasing priority in the United States. Organizations have been created to offer support, treatment, and reintegration. This demonstrates an institutional and cultural evolution. The country has learned from past mistakes and invested more in the care of those who served. For him, the greatest challenge wasn't accepting that the war was over. It was accepting that there was still life after it. He needed to rebuild his identity, find purpose, redefine his routine. The discipline that kept him alive in the jungle became a tool to rebuild his own stability. He started giving lectures. He talked to young soldiers. He shared lessons about loyalty, but also about the importance of clear communication and responsible leadership. His story isn't just about isolation. It's about the strength of the American culture of service and resilience. It's about how a man can remain true to his mission even when the world changes. And it's also about how a country can evolve to better recognize those who have defended it. The return didn't erase the lost years, but it transformed the experience into collective learning. And when he finally visited a memorial dedicated to those who served in Vietnam, touching the names engraved in stone, something became clear. The war had ended on paper decades earlier, but the meaning of service remains alive, not as permanent conflict, but as memory, responsibility, and respect. The jungle was behind him. The mission was over. What remained was the identity of someone who served with conviction until the very last possible moment. And that is a story that remains relevant for any generation that wears a uniform and takes an oath. What almost no one realizes is that the hardest war began after he returned home. In the jungle, the enemy was visible, or at least identifiable. There were clear protocols. There were rules of engagement. There was an objective. In the United States, the battlefield was invisible. There were no maps. There was no commander. There was no final order dictating how to rebuild a life interrupted by years of silence. In the first few months, he would wake up before dawn, just as he had in Vietnam. He would walk silently through the house, checking doors and windows, analyzing sounds that would seem normal to anyone else. A car passing on the street, a neighbor closing the gate, a dog barking. His body still functioned as if it were in hostile territory. His mind took time to accept that he was on American soil, protected by everything he believed he was defending. Many veterans report something similar. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs released data years later showing that a significant portion of Vietnam combatants faced persistent symptoms of post-traumatic stress. This is not a sign of weakness. It is a consequence of years in a state of extreme alertness. The brain learns to survive that way. Unlearning requires time and support. He began to perceive an internal conflict he hadn't expected. Part of him felt pride for having remained faithful to the mission. Another part questioned whether he should have suspected the prolonged silence sooner. Had he interpreted discipline as absolute obligation? Had he confused loyalty with an inability to accept change? These questions had no simple answers, and no decoration resolves this kind of doubt. In a meeting with other veterans, he heard stories from men who also continued fighting after they returned home. Not with weapons, but with memories. One of them recounted how it took him years to be able to sit in a restaurant without automatically choosing the seat where he could see all the exits. Another reported avoiding fireworks on Independence Day because the sound triggered memories he didn't want to relive. These stories created an immediate bond. They understood each other without needing to over-explain. There's a fact that surprises many people. Decades after the end of the Vietnam War, studies indicated that a portion of veterans still presented symptoms related to the conflict. This demonstrates how extreme experiences leave deep scars. At the same time, it shows the strength of those who decide to continue living despite these scars. The American service culture has always valued resilience. But resilience doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means the ability to move forward even with it. He decided to transform his experience into something constructive. He began to speak openly about his period of isolation, not to portray himself as a victim, but to highlight the importance of clear communication and responsible leadership. In lectures to young military personnel, he emphasized that discipline is essential, but that no mission should be sustained solely by silence. The chain of command exists to protect lives, not just to direct them. During one of these lectures, a young recruit asked if he regretted staying in the jungle for so long. The answer took a few seconds. He explained that he didn't regret his loyalty. To regret it would be to deny everything he believed about serving his country. But he recognized that the world changes and that part of maturity is knowing when a phase ends. Loyalty doesn't have to be blind, it can be conscious. He also began visiting schools and universities, sharing the complexities of what it means to serve in a conflict that divided opinions within the country itself. Many students heard for the first time a direct account from someone who lived through the extremes of that period. He spoke about responsibility, about honor, and about the human consequences of political decisions. Always reinforcing that, regardless of the historical circumstances, the men and women who wear the uniform do so with genuine commitment. Over time, something changed within him. The silence that once represented abandonment began to be reinterpreted as part of a larger chaotic context. He understood that systems fail, that wars are unpredictable, that evacuations are complex. This doesn't erase the fact that he was isolated, but it helps to reorganize his internal narrative. Instead of seeing himself as forgotten, he began to see himself as someone who went through an extreme situation and survived. The most symbolic moment came when he visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Touching the names engraved in the black stone, he realized that his story was just one among millions. Each name represented a family, an interrupted dream, a commitment made. He remained silent for several minutes. It wasn't the silence of the jungle. It was the silence of recognition. There, finally, he understood that war does not define a man's worth. Service does. The willingness to answer the call, even without guarantees, is what remains. The war ended decades ago, but the responsibility to remember, learn from, and support those who served remains relevant. And perhaps that is the last mission that truly matters, not to fight again, but to ensure that no one who has served feels alone in the silence again. There's an image that never left his mind. It wasn't combat, it wasn't an explosion. It was the exact moment he descended from his elevated position in the jungle and walked towards the truth. That simple step was harder than any infiltration behind enemy lines. Because at that instant, he wasn't facing an army. He was facing the possibility that everything that had sustained him for years no longer existed. For a long time, he believed that the greatest proof of courage was to persevere. To persevere even when hungry. To persevere even when afraid. To persevere even in absolute silence. But years later, he realized something that no combat manual teaches. Sometimes true courage is to stop. To stop when the mission is over, to stop when the context changes, to stop when persisting becomes silent self-destruction. This is the turning point that transforms this story into something bigger than a military account. He wasn't just the soldier who didn't know the war was over. He became the man who had to relearn how to live after the war ended. And this transition was more brutal than any armed conflict, because in the jungle he knew exactly who he was. At home, he had to rebuild that identity from scratch. Think about it for a moment. How many people continue fighting battles that are already over? How many men and women continue reacting to threats that no longer exist? How many parents continue treating adult children as if they were still children? How many professionals remain stuck in an old model because that's how they learned? His war was literal. Ours may be invisible. But the internal mechanism is the same. The most striking part isn't the time he spent isolated. It's the fact that he could have continued indefinitely if no one had insisted, if no one had brought evidence, if no one had approached him without hostility. He would have grown old in the jungle defending a mission the world had already ended. And that reveals something profound about the human mind. We cling to what gives us purpose, even when that purpose no longer makes sense. But here's the emotional contrast that changes everything. He didn't end up as a victim. He ended up as an example. He decided to use his story to warn new generations. He spoke about discipline, but also about awareness. He spoke about loyalty, but also about adaptation. He spoke about honor, but also about mental health. He transformed years of isolation into a tool for collective learning. And perhaps that is the most powerful message of this story. Serving the United States has always meant more than following orders. It means protecting values. And one of those values is the ability to learn from the past. The country that sent men to difficult conflicts also learned to take better care of those who return. It learned that the mission does not end when the soldier sets foot on American soil again. It continues in support, in recognition, in listening. At the climax of his own life, he understood that he had not been forgotten. The system may have failed in communication. The chaos may have been greater than any planning. But the nation he believed he was defending was still there, evolving, acknowledging mistakes, honoring names, investing in support for veterans. This realization brought something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The jungle is behind us. The silent radio is a thing of the past. The burned pamphlet is a distant memory. What remains is the understanding that war is not just a historical event. It is an experience that shapes people. And how those people choose to live after the conflict is the true test of character. If this story touched you, if you served, know someone who served, or simply believe that stories like this need to be told with respect and depth, I ask something simple. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, so that more people can hear stories that go beyond the headlines. And leave your questions, reflections, or personal experiences in the comments. Your story can help someone who is still fighting a silent battle. Because in the end, the greatest mission is not to win wars. It's to ensure that no one is left alone in silence after they are over.